Hello and welcome to The Nation This Week, a brand new format discussing the news of the week. In this week's panel, I have Nordin, Dr. Helmy, and DATUK Dr. A.T. KUMARAJAH joining me. We recap this week in the news. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's get right to it. As an icebreaker, perhaps, the Prime Minister has just recently announced a special Parliament meeting that will be held to discuss flood crisis beginning January 20th onwards. Now, individually, what are the areas that should be focused in the Parliament according to your views and perspective? Nordin, let's begin with you.
Well, Jesse, what I want to see is a better structuring of the response, and not just we're talking about the time it took for response, but more about understanding everyone's role within the response. So if we're thinking about it in terms of an orchestra, everyone has their part to play. Who is the conductor, and which parts do you have to play? So I think there was quite a bit of commentary around, this agency should be doing that and this other agency should be doing this. But the reality was that agency was not tasked to do that. But I think the other part of that is to ensure that the public knows each person's role or each agency's role. And I think that's also part of a deeper narrative that we need to build into crisis response.
Helmy, A.T., please feel free to jump in this roundtable discussion. A.T., perhaps you'd like to go ahead with what are the areas you think that needs to be focused on at this point?
Yeah, if you're looking at an emergency first, it's really not an emergency, because if it should have been held now as opposed to being held in the month of January, so we are a kind of a month late into, it's not so much of an emergency. This is like, Operation Successful, Patient Dead kind of a story. But despite that, like what Nordin said, right? So I think what's lacking is not necessarily our experience and expertise that we have in the institutions and agencies that are working around this, because this is not the first time we're having a flood or any of these emergency disasters. The issue is coordination, and that central command control, unified command control centers was sort of missing, and leadership was sorely lacking. I think that was the biggest issue as far as I can see. Pure lack of leadership, a will to move, and I'm not sure whether it has got something to do with the year-end breaks and people being away, but that's something which really must be brought back into some sort of a central command center. We did this right even with the COVID response. Why do we get it wrong with something which is happening every year, day in, day out?
Helmy?
I would concur with that, because there seems to be this feeling that, we can take our time with this. It's literally it'll be about a month between the floods being an issue and there being a parliamentary sitting. So I suppose the question is, what value would a parliamentary sitting be to us as the people, right? Yeah. And, things like emergency funding, all these things are things that need people to agree to ensure that proper governance is in place, that things are scrutinized properly. But in the meantime, there's still a lot of other things that can be done and should be done better. So things like, in terms of knowing where to go, who to call for help. I think Nordin mentioned just now, sometimes people just don't even know where to go if they need help. And these are things that I suspect can be improved if there was a little bit more coordination when it comes to comms.
Right, absolutely. I think I need to reiterate that is that communication needs to be perhaps enhanced or tightened. Some of the lessons that we have learned from 2021 have been exactly that. And here's hoping that, 2022 we have brighter and better foresight. Nordin, I want to come to that later when you do want to reiterate the importance of hindsight being the new foresight. We'll come to that in a short while. Let's begin with the EPF issue as well, scraping the bottom of the barrel. A.T., you wanted to weigh in into this as well.
Yeah, because I mean, primarily again, right? So I'm sure, like what Helmy mentioned, all right? It's something that's going to be spoken about in January, in this January sitting, and it's going to be purely about what is it that we should have done and what is it that we could have done. But primarily, many of them are saying, look, I think there is a political group which says that we must allow another withdrawal from the EPF. And as any number speaks from there, you can actually see that nearly 6 million people are really not even in that bracket of people who can actually withdraw. And if you allow this last withdrawal, you're going to bring 6 million to 7 million of our 15 million EPF subscribers who don't really have more than 10,000 ringgit in their account 1 and account 2. So primarily, that long-term savings shouldn't be used for short-term disasters like this. Government should step in. This is the time. This is a one-off occurrence, right? So you don't step in for long-term issues with short-term interventions. So this is something that the government should step in, not touch the EPF. We already done these 3 rounds, Lestari, Citra, and another one, right? So we've done about $110 billion have been drained out of our system. That alone has put many people's problem in the future forward. So we have basically this government or this leadership now is basically passing all these problems and says, look, I don't get really what happens down 20 years down the line. This group of people probably have to work another 4 to 5 years extra just to recoup what's already been taken out from the system. So that's really the wrong strategy. We should not even entertain such a request.
Mm-hmm. In a crisis, though, do we go to what we are familiar with, or do we create a brand new strategy or way around it? What are some of your opinions, Dr.?
I mean, again, right? So if this is what people...
I think AT is having a bit of a lag on that side. Perhaps, gentlemen, you'd like to step in, Nordin?
Well, I kind of agree with Dato here, because when you borrow from the future, you're robbing from now as well. So what we're going to see is a demographic and an economic time bomb if you take out that amount of money now. Now, we talk about the horizon of now. Most people can't think 20, 30 years down the road. They can only think that, okay, look, I've got this problem right now. So it can't be by design. EPF is not designed to handle short-term crises. So it's about redefining the role of EPF. Is that a question, or are we going to redefine a disaster fund that needs to be put in place for people to handle that? So I think, we're trying to find the eggs and put them in different baskets, but is it giving us the right answers? I think the real question, Jesse, is what is the economic impact? Now, we talk about the losses, and we see what insurance companies can show us in terms of losses, but how long will it take for businesses to recover from being in those flood zones? So you're thinking of using money now, but now, is it a month, a week, or 2-3 years will it take for people to get back to the economic parity where they're at today after being hit by a flood? This data we don't have.
Right, Helmy, how do you view this issue?
I have very similar thoughts to ATK because I recall, was it Noor Hisham Hussain, the Chief Strategic Officer for EPF? I remember him mentioning in one of his talks that only about 3% of EPF contributors can actually afford to retire. And this is before COVID has really hit us. This is before the floods. And there's lots of statistics showing about how the bulk of EPF contributions come from the T20 group anyway. So the ones who are going to be suffering disproportionately are also the ones who are being told to withdraw from their future. And that aside, to me, there's also the consideration to be made with regards to EPF as a funding or as a fund. Getting them to divert funds to things that are perhaps not their core businesses, such as supporting the cost of natural, or perhaps one could argue floods are not natural events, is taking them away from funds that will allow them to actually invest for our future as well as an entity. So I'm very much on the same kind of, I suppose, mindset or thoughts when it comes to whether or not we should be using EPF as a way to withdraw money. But rather, I think there are other mechanisms. And once again, if there was a little bit more focus, I suppose, on where to get this funding from, it might be easier to help people today rather than robbing them from what they have tomorrow.
That's right. December 2021 was a disastrous month for the entire nation. In fact, thousands and thousands of people have been affected by the floods. But I also know, I hear the panel echoing that it was a flood of mistakes as well that unfortunately took place. Let's move on to discussing the issue of vandalism, which is one of the perhaps key areas in which many of these disasters happened because of a lack of a system or infrastructure in place. A siren, or the siren, was stolen. And where do you think we stand in terms of awareness of public property and procurement of the right equipment, i.e. how do we improve our infrastructure around an impending natural disaster, obviously one that does not have a natural sounding alarm for AT?
So Jesse, again, that's why we come back to what is it that we have been all this time using, and why not we recreate it? Okay, Sri Muda, let's talk about exactly these geographic examples, right? So we got this this years of experience of doing all this on our East Coast states. Year in, year out, there are places where we actually have floods. So Sri Muda, okay, happens 30 years once, or what, 25 years once. So maybe these early warning systems were not there, but we have had the experience having a tsunami in 2004. So this early warning systems, I've seen the minister today morning has actually mentioned that he's putting up another committee to start looking at what is it that the early warning systems are. I'm not sure whether instead a committee is needed, or actually we can actually copy paste some of these experiences, that if we don't have it, why not we do what Japan is doing? After all, those guys go through these nuclear disasters and some of these things in a more frequent manner and in a larger scale. So why not we just copy paste and localize some of these responses? They may work better. Vandalism, I suppose, if the interventions did not happen at a particular point in time, it's easy for us, me and you, I'm sure all of us have been to the ground at some point in time. It's easier for us to speak about in hindsight. But actually, if you are stuck, I had a nurse who works with my wife, and she says, look, if they didn't come within the next hour, she would have probably drowned, and she was without food for 2 days. That's really happening. So in such a desperate situation, people take desperate measures, and then you really cannot use normal social benchmarks and says, look, you shouldn't have reached this, because in desperate situations, when the government especially has failed, and I think people will go on to do what's right. And it happened to one of those hypermarket owners who actually went on to halalkan that act, but that was because he was magnanimous. It is not because it was right.
Yeah. Well, the police are looking into the missing wiring of a flood warning siren box at a Department of Irrigation and Drainage, DID, retention pond in Taman Sungai Gemas, which of course came to light earlier this week as well. Nordin, Helmy, please feel free to jump in. From the floods, what sort of other areas do you think are points of contention so that we can improve in terms of infrastructure, hindsight, moving forward, so that in the event, in this rainy season, in the event this occurrence does happen again, we are all better prepared in the short term?
Well, Jesse, one of the things I'd like to say is you can't use the word if. You just should use the word when. And when you start to use if, it's a very dangerous word. And one of the things, when you go back to that early warning system that was damaged or vandalized, the question is, why wasn't there a procedure put in place to check all of these things on an ongoing basis? I'd like to see the audit on when that was last checked, and when is everything checked. So when you start to do this kind of micromanaging on a disaster level, you need to start to look at either third-party auditors or a community watch program, a community program that says, hey, we're the community at risk. We know now what needs to be there. And is there a mechanism for them to just take a photo of that device, send it to that department, and will they respond in time? And these are the kind of responses that I'd like to see, a deeper community involvement. And that means a deeper community responsibility to the problem. And I know there's a lot of talk of what the government should do, The government also has limited resources. So now it's about pooling the resources of the community and the government together to get the response right. And that's really going to be the hardest part, because now you can't, it's not about relying or not relying on the government. It's everyone in the same boat together. And the metaphor is, that people, if you get it wrong, there'll be people in flood boats.
Especially now with social media as well, they will be called out. Dr. Helmy, let's move on to the Omicron variant. Apparently, it's not a mild variant. Let's explore this a little bit more.
So at this point in time, it would appear that it's a milder variant, in the sense that as an individual, if you were to get it, then chances are there's a lesser risk of you developing complications such as going to ICU or leading to death. And those who appear to be suffering from worse complications appear to be those who have either not been vaccinated or have not been adequately boosted. So we are now going through this phase where it's not just about making sure we have our basic vaccinations against COVID, but getting the extra booster dose 3 months down the line. But it also appears that Omicron is highly contagious. So even if the percentage of those who get more severe complications is low, but when it comes to sheer volumes, then the small percentage will translate to high numbers. So 1% of 3,000 is very different to 1% of 3 million, for example. And that is where we have to be careful, because if the numbers creep up, then we are once again at the risk of having another wave that could potentially overwhelm our resources. And what we're seeing now in countries like Australia, the United States, the United Kingdom, the healthcare services are troubled not only in terms of patients coming in, but also in terms of actual staffing levels falling, because staff themselves are falling ill or getting COVID. And as a consequence, you can see how this affects not only the care provided to those who have COVID, but also non-COVID conditions. Because one of the things we usually forget to talk about is the impact all this focus on COVID has on non-COVID issues. So your heart attacks, your cancers, your TBs, these are all situations and conditions that are still out there, but there's always going to be a delay in diagnosis and treatment when so much focus and resources are on COVID.
That's right. I want to move on to vaccination. Of course, many people getting their boosters at this point of time. The WHO PIC, or person in charge, has talked about vaccine inequity, that many people do not have fair access. Malaysia, one of the blessed countries so far, it does seem like our vaccination program is rolling out pretty well indeed. But gentlemen, roundtable. Now, Malaysia has just approved Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine for children aged 5 to 11. How do you weigh in on this?
I mean, for me, I think it's a good idea because it will potentially help lots of parents, especially, feel a little bit more comfortable about kids going in. It'll be helpful in terms of protecting children, protecting schools, protecting teachers. And if we look at the data, for most parents, our main concern is going to be whether this is safe for our kids, because you want to protect them from something, but at the same time,
5-year-olds, doctor, they are tiny tots, 5-year-olds. I mean, do we have enough data to back
so
this?
how much is enough data then? It becomes the question. You're absolutely right. We're dealing with a new situation with a virus that's barely 2 years old, or perhaps a little bit more than 2 years old, and we're dealing with new variants that are months old. So it's always going to be a balance of balancing the potential benefits and the potential risks. Now, if we look at what the good or bad thing about having things a little bit later than countries like Israel and the United States is we get to see what's happening over there first before we start to implement our own policies. So things like injecting the elderly, things like injecting children, all these have been done elsewhere. And there has been very strong focus on collecting data to not only look at the positive outcomes, but the potentially negative outcomes as well. And if we look at, I think it was data that was published by the CDC recently, they looked at about almost 9 million children, 9 million, 8.7 million if I'm not mistaken. And there was something like 0.001% of very adverse effects. So you can look at the definition of adverse effects, so things like being hospitalized or being severe enough that you need care. But if you compare that with the rate of adverse effects on deaths amongst children from COVID, then you can do a better comparison and analysis with regards to which one's better for your child.
AT?
Jesse, but again, the other thing, right? So Helmy mentioned about all the scientific base for it. But I think one good silver lining in this Omicron developing story is the fact that the government has said, look, using the national recovery phase, we will not go back. Kita takkan menoleh ke belakang. I think that's what YBKJ said. So I think that's a very good step, because despite the rising number of cases, it may not be very severe, but the infectivity rates are higher. But still, we probably would not want to decipher off our socioeconomic benefits. Otherwise, we're really going to go back into Stone Age. So I think that is a very forward-looking statement by the government, saying that we will not go back. We will mitigate this risk as much. We will use everything within our means, I think, both in healthcare resources, in terms of capacity, and also in terms of mitigating factors. But it's a good way to move forward. I think Omicron is still a very much developing story. I think I even read about the second booster dose, and we're probably not very far from getting another shot ourselves.
But how do we sign a waiver for a 5-year-old? I mean, how?
But right? So I think we do for pediatric cases ourselves. I mean, I'm sure our kids all got it when they were much, much smaller. So maybe this is the new norms. I'm sure if you got kids, you probably want to inoculate them themselves.
That's right. We want to keep them safe.
I would like to say also, yeah. I mean, I would also like to say that I'm one of my youngest is 11, and it's purely an emotional decision for me. Because one of the things is I would feel better knowing that he's been vaccinated for him to go back to school next week. So there is an emotional level of the reality of people dealing with it. So it's kind of an interesting problem for adults. You need to make an emotional decision around a scientific problem.
That's very true.
It's a brand new year. Doctor, yes?
No, I'm sorry, I'm just saying that, add on to what Nordin said, it is actually a decision that we make as adults as well. We use a lot of emotions and a lot of discussion points with friends, families, loved ones when we're making these decisions for our health. We don't always follow just the data, but this is where comms and getting people to talk about things like what we're doing right now, I think is very helpful.
It's a brand new year, 2022. Why does it look like we haven't learned anything? A statement. But you have a tagline. Hindsight is the new foresight, Nordin. Let us in.
Yes. Well, that really started as a bit of a tongue-in-cheek statement, looking at a lot of the commentary that was going on around the floods. But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized actually we've got a wealth of data. We've got a wealth of commentary that now the government can now mine. When we talk about the upcoming session of Parliament, actually, what are we trying to achieve? One, we will get one set of data from the flood victims, the number of flood victims, the amount of money, and all this kind of data. But there's also a massive amount of intellectual value in mining the data and mining the comments of everybody who have been dealing with this either on the ground or commenting on various parts. And for me, we're looking at it, the classic story of three blind men holding an elephant. So we all come from our different perspectives. So how do we step back far enough and get enough of that data that we can start to make deeper and more insightful and more make decisions which are using foresight as opposed to just the emotional, and we're dealing with the emotions again, and just dealing with those emotional realities. So that's the difficult part.
Okay, so what is it about structure then?
Structure, what I want to see is once you have the structure of putting the commentary into each area. So when you start to look at the data around the flood zones itself, now what about the commentary that goes with that data, and how do we put these two pieces of the puzzle together? Right now we're just using the piece of data, and the commentary is out there floating around in cyberspace or in the media space. How do we bring this all together and turn it into business intelligence and an intelligence approach as opposed to just a simple data approach?
Right, gentlemen, let's talk a little bit about what is also perhaps trending in terms of integrity as well. SPRM's video about bribing for MC. Dr. Helmy, perhaps you'd like to start this.
Well, I suppose there are... Sorry? I have to think, how I put this across. There are many ways.
You can blame it on your brother after that, right?
Pardon me?
You can blame it on your brother after that.
That is true. Also, I might not ever be invited to the show again. So it's my avatar that's saying it, right? But I suppose, if I were to be a bit objective about it, there are many ways in which one can have issues of integrity, right? And there's no denying that there are going to be black sheep in any profession, whether you're doctors or lawyers or engineers or politicians, some perhaps more than others. So I would argue that in such circumstances, we need to highlight the issue of governance, of corruption, but it would be useful to highlight it in context that is more in keeping with what's really the problem in the country at the moment. So I think this is going beyond just any single profession, but really the way we approach the problem as a society, and the way where we see perhaps in some circumstances there's not sufficient punishment, or there's not enough people who are actually taking the responsibility for what they're doing or being punished for what they've done. I think those are more of an issue rather than whether or not an MC is something that can be bought off a doctor in a clinic in Bangsa or somewhere.
Right. MMA is also demanding for an apology. Perhaps, AT, you'd like to weigh in, and Nordin, and then I leave you the last minute to
exactly
round up
right.
as we close in.
Yeah, but that's what Helmy said, right? So while the content and the container may not be very wrong in terms of what they're trying to say, but the context is very, very wrong. Not do it now, and especially use frontliners and doctors and even paramedics for the matter, and then say that this is what we want to do. I mean, is that the biggest issue as we have it now? Is that the biggest issue that even the agency, that specific agency, is suffering from? That's really not the case. The integrity issue is not really with the people or not on these issues. The integrity issue seems to be structural. It is a lot more at the highest level as opposed to the level where we're talking about this guy who's paying off for an MC. But that's really being very, very granular about it. I think we're missing the woods for the forest. And actually, that while we're not arguing with the fact of that messaging, but really bad context. And I think we have got larger issues to manage, including those agencies themselves. What's good for the goose must be good for the gander.
Well said, Nordin.
Well, Dato', I wanted to add that actually what we're seeing is a change in the social contract. And I think this is what we're seeing now. It's becoming socially unacceptable for these things to happen. And I think when you look at the reputational damage and the fallout from this, you're starting to see more and more Malaysians saying no to this type of behavior. So I think while we're not happy with a specific case, or specific cases in that sense, we are moving to a better destination. And I think the fact that we know that we're in a journey is actually helping the process. And I think it comes down to an improvement of the social contract.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for weighing in all nuggets of information and insights that would really be beneficial for all of us to ponder on as we take on this brand new year. We'll speak to all of you soon. Take care. This has been The Nation This Week with me, Jessie Gerard. We'll speak to you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.